Thank you for being here. I'm going to be talking about some of the updates and some of the things that we're changing with the lab management program. Some of you may be already familiar with the lab program. Some of you may not be familiar with the lab program, but this might still be of interest to you. We're also going to cover off some aspects of listings, what those listings mean, and how to interpret the information that's on that listing information as well. So we're going to talk about that update to the lab management process and the onboarding process. And importantly, got a word here, modular. So we're going to be talking about modular lab program, which is going to be a process where we're disconnecting the PTS labs potentially from the MPOC labs. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. We're also going to be talking about some of the information that we're providing to our vendors in terms of the review process. And all of this, if you were at the talk that I gave earlier on today, I was talking about how we're updating our standards, but it's not just about the standards, it's about the programs as well. And so all of these things I'm going to be talking about, this is all based on feedback that we've been receiving from our stakeholders in terms of we would like to be able to, for example, become an MPOC lab or a COTS lab without being a PTS lab first. We would like to have more information on the listing process and how things are listed. We would like, as a vendor, to understand what is going on with a report when we submit it, where it is in the queue, what is happening with that. And so these are things that we have implemented or are implementing based on that stakeholder feedback. I'm going to talk a little bit more about onboarding now. So all this feedback that we have been getting, some of it has been, well, MPOC's a great standard, it's a fantastic program, we're really interested in it, but you know what? As an entity, we'd like to be an assessor of MPOC solutions, MPOC products, but we don't want to really be involved in the PTS program. So those of you who are not familiar with PTS, PTS POI, physical devices, HSMs, POIs, that sort of thing, we have the COTS programs, which are primarily software-based, although there is back-end requirements around procedures and processes and environmental security as well. But they do have similar aspects. They both cover software, for example. They both cover firmware. They both cover cryptography and pins. But there are differences where PTS is very focused on hardware as well. It's very focused on the physical aspects of the devices. And the labs who are PTS devices need to have skills and experience in terms of understanding those physical aspects. They need to understand how PCBs go together, how chips are put together, understand how a tamper detection system works, understand how the casing can be attacked from various points of view, do, for example, side channel analysis on cryptography on those particular processes, these sorts of things that not necessarily are applicable to a piece of software that runs on an MPOC solution. So the feedback we've been hearing is people would like to be a COTS lab without going through PTS. And previously, up till now, we have had the process of you must be a PTS lab, and then if you're a PTS lab, you can then additionally become a COTS lab and do SPOC, CPOC, MPOC testing as well. So with the modular onboarding process, labs can make a decision. They might still choose to do both, and that is perfectly fine. However, they might choose to be an MPOC-only lab or a PTS-only lab, and that's also fine as well. Now, there's details around this that we're still working on, so watch this space. But ultimately, there are still things that are required for any particular approved lab. So the lab must declare the program, obviously, that they wish to assess. So if you're an entity and you would like to be a PTS lab, you would like to be an MPOC lab, you would like to be perhaps both labs, you have to make that declaration. You have to say, we're interested in this program or another program. The lab must complete the pre-onboarding paperwork and go through the administrative processes and so forth. And importantly, there's a test artifact evaluation. So in PTS, that is a physical device, something that you must assess as a POI, essentially, to make sure you have that ability, that skill, that knowledge within your laboratory to do that physical testing, to understand how the PCB goes together, to understand how to get to the tamper grids inside there, maybe understand that, you know what, this particular via at this location, that's probably a test point that connects to the tamper response circuitry. So if I raise that up to VDC on the circuit, I can then disable the tamper responses, the switches are disabled, I can take the case off, I can install a bug on the circuitry, on the keypad of that device. These are the sorts of skills and knowledge that we're looking for in our labs. But once again, different to what people might need with an MPOC lab. So with COTS labs, we still have a process where people must go through that test artifact process. They must be able to demonstrate to us that they have the skills, the knowledge, the ability, but this time it's more focused on the mobile security aspect. So do you have knowledge, for example, of code obfuscation? Do you have knowledge and skills, for example, in understanding how software-based cryptography or white box cryptography works and reversing those implementations? Do you have skills and knowledge around how the communications and systems work in general within mobile architectures, the way in which applications are deployed and used in those architectures, and the way in which they can be reversed and hooked and these sorts of things? So you still need to go through that test artifact process, but this would be for the COTS implementations. Now, there's still a large cross-section of commonality between these two programs. So they're not completely divergent. It is not a disjoint union. You still have very large crossover between the programs in terms of understanding of cryptography, understanding of software security, understanding of secure channels, understanding of random numbers. I could probably essentially, mentally, I'm reading off the requirements in domain 1 of MPOC, and most of those essentially are very similar to requirements we have in PTS as well. But there are differences, and we have heard what the market's asking. We're looking at separating these two things. At the end of the day, test artifact, we as PCI then review the process and the documentation that you've gone through. Maybe there's some follow-up questions and so forth, but then you could become potentially a PTS lab, an MPOC lab, a COTS lab, or one or both. So if you're a lab and you've gone through that process, what is next? Well, unfortunately, that's not the end. There are still additional requirements that exist. There needs to be policies and procedures and quality management around how you do an assessment and how you manage your staff and your technical systems, your test tools, your test samples, these sorts of things. Generally, this would be something that you would find in something like ISO 17025 or Handbook 150 that are around quality management of labs, of making sure not only can you do the job properly, but you can do the job properly the same way each time. And when there's errors, when there's faults, when there's problems, you've got a continual improvement process in that as well. So we need to make sure you have that in your policies and procedures. You also need to have sufficient physical security in your location to make sure that you have the control around the test samples that you're being given, controls around the information that you're building out, in terms of the physical systems and so forth. So there needs to be literally a physical security lab. We call it a high security area, or HSA, within your environment to make sure that you have those controls and those systems are protected. But physical security is only one aspect. As we all know, everything's networked these days. All the computers exist on a system. So you need logical security as well. Because as a test lab, you will receive, or the test labs do receive, very sensitive information from their customers. If it's PTS, they might be getting, for example, schematics and PCB layout files. They might be getting source code. They might be getting information on how that system goes together, how the key management works, these sorts of things. Perhaps information on the security processes that exist within that device. If it is an MPOC or COTS system, you'll be getting similar, but perhaps sometimes different information, still source code. Information on how the cryptography works, information perhaps on how your software-based cryptography system works, information on how your back-end environment works for an attestation and monitoring system. All of this and more, very sensitive information, needs to be kept securely by the lab, but importantly, that is then processed by the laboratory to create the actual assessment report. And that assessment report, also very sensitive, in some ways perhaps even more sensitive than the information that's being received, because that's taking all of that information that's been provided by the client and distilling it down into, I'm not going to say a short report, but let's say a report of some kind. It's usually about 500 to 600 pages, but a report that says, here is how this device works. Here is how this particular COTS implementation works. Here is the information on how they are providing security. And importantly, they have things called attack costings, which is this is how we as a lab would attack this system. And so very sensitive information in there that needs to be protected. So we need, as PCI SSE, to validate. Not only do you have procedures for quality, not only do you have physical security, you have logical security controls as well. And then there's resource handling in terms of physical resources, for example, lab equipment, to make sure that you're managing your equipment there properly. Also, the resources and information that you're getting from the clients, but also your human resources. How are you making sure if you've got one particular expert who does side channel or who does code reversing or something like this, how do you make sure that they are sufficiently available for the evaluations that you have booked so that you don't go, you know what, that person's not available at the moment, we'll just get somebody else to do it. But maybe they're not going to do a good enough job, and that's not what you have been qualified for. So resource handling is important as well. And this whole process can take between 12 and 18 months. It's not a short process, but there are a lot of steps that we have to go through, physical on-site audits that we perform, and validation of your test artifact review and these sorts of things to make sure that the job is being done correctly. And importantly, we're now implementing this process. You can do it for PTS, or you could do it for COTS as well separately. So another item that we've had feedback on is from vendors who are going to the labs. They're submitting their products. They're submitting whether it be an MPOC product or a PTS device or a HSM or something like that. And it goes into the lab does the testing, the lab talks to the client as they're doing this work, and they say, okay, we've got this report. That report is submitted to PCI SSE, and we review each and every one of those reports. Now, we've had feedback that has been potentially a bit of an unknown. They submit the report, and then there's no real feedback that people are receiving. So we've heard that feedback. We're now implementing a process where each week there is a status that is added to everything that is in the report reviewer's queue, and that status can then be communicated out to the vendors to make sure that you are aware. Is it currently under review? Is it something that has open questions at the moment? Are there sufficient questions that it might have been returned? These sorts of things. So there is a timer on these. If the timer is set to 0, the letter of approval is issued, assuming everything else is in place. Let me move on to an example here. So here is an example. The names have been changed to protect the innocent here. But you can see there's a status here. There's active 27 days left, halted, active 9 days left. And if we move over to the other side here, this reviewer status, this is the new thing that we have implemented where it will say, okay, 27 days left, it's in the reviewer's queue. It hasn't been opened yet. It's something that we are going to get to. Obviously, something comes in. It may have just been submitted yesterday. It's going to take somebody to open it. Once it's opened, they will review it. The reviewers have a look at it. They make sure that it meets the requirements. Now here what I mean is the reviewers are checking through and making sure we have test requirements under PTS, we have test requirements under things like MPOC, making sure that the report is following those test requirements, is meeting those test requirements, and is internally consistent. The report, for example, says at one point the product does X, and then later on in the report it might say the product does Y, and X and Y are very different and incompatible. That might be something where the reviewers raise a query. And that's something that absolutely happens, because sometimes, as you know, when the report's generating, maybe it used to do X all the time, or maybe it used to do Y all the time, and it was changed during the process of the lab doing the evaluation. One section of the report was updated, another section of the report wasn't updated, internally inconsistent. That's something that we cannot approve at that point. Additionally, the test requirements outline, as I said, what needs to be done. We need to make sure that has been followed, because those test requirements are defined to make sure it's addressing the risk profile, the threat landscape that exists, and we need to make sure that those steps have been followed correctly. But open queries, so reviewer will open it, there might be some queries raised where they say, hang on, it says X over here, it says Y over here, I don't understand. And it could just be a query. It could be, well, actually, let me explain that a little bit more. And it might be something, okay, I understand that. Or it might be, oh, actually, yes, that's an error. We need to update that. If there are updates, then it might go into a new report cycle. That would be updated here. If it's under review and there are no open queries, it would be listed as under review. And that would be something where the timer could run down and it would be approved, or potentially we would just come back once again each week and say, you know what, we've gone through that report, we had queries, those queries were answered, that report can now be approved. So in terms of listings, here's a listing, once again, names have been changed to protect the innocent. Vendor name, so that's the vendor name up here, the vendor of the product. We have the model name of the particular device. There is an expiry date over here for the overall device. There's pictures and labels here. There's basically a picture that is on the listing. You can click on that, and that will show you more pictures and labels of the device, so you can make sure that you have the actual device that you intended to get that was approved. And importantly, when it comes to that, there's also a security policy for PTS. And that security policy not only defines information about how the device works, but it's an important document that helps everybody understand what the scope of the evaluation was. This is what the lab essentially reviewed in terms of what that device does. So if the security policy says, you know what, you need to review this device for the slot for bugs every day, that was what the lab had in mind when they were conducting their attack costings. If the security policy says it only implements AES, and you get the device and it does TDES, well, you know what? That's no longer something that would have been approved by the lab. So it's really important to review the security policy. We also have a new process for firmware expiry now. The firmware expires approximately every 3 years, I believe. And so not only does the whole product have a device expiry, but we want to make sure that the firmware is up to date. Because although it might be okay to have a device, a physical thing, that is considered secure for 9 years, software tends to age a little bit quicker than that. And we want to make sure that the firmware is kept up to date. So in terms of MPOC, very similar thing here. We have vendor names, we have the reference numbers. It's important here that an MPOC listing will show the types of operating systems that it has been approved for. So if you get something that's approved for Android 11, 12, 13, and they say, you know what, you can deploy it for Android 10, well, that's not what it has been approved for. Similar thing for software down here, Android versions. It also lists the types of account data entry methods that are supported by that particular product as well. And here you can see COTS native contactless, NFC interface on the phone, and COTS native PIN support. That's PIN entry on the phone, or COTS device as it is. There was a link on that other one as well to dive deeper, and if you click on that link, then you get the solution details, gives a little bit more information here about versions. Once again, has some similar stuff and potentially might be product supported if it references and uses another MPOC product. For example, an MPOC service might implement an existing listed MPOC software product, and so this is where those details would be found. I was just about to say, so that's it for me, and I think I've just choked. So that's it for me for now. So thank you very much. I will be on the booth later on and around. If you have any questions on any of these programs, I'll be happy to direct you to someone else who's on the booth. No, I can probably answer it for you. So thank you very much.